Hi, this is a video showing off the anti-tiling features of MicroSplat. If you purchase this module, it will add a number of features to MicroSplat that help deal with tiling issues. So I'm in a little terrain here that I generated with MapMagick. MapMagick is a great little terrain generation system. If you like shader graph type frameworks, you'll be right at home with it. But one thing you'll notice is that there's quite a bit of tiling here on this grass texture, especially on this rock texture on the hills. Now, you can eliminate a lot of this by blending between textures more often and things like that, using more textures, and that can be a great way to help break things up, but sometimes you're just going to end up with repeated tiles like this. And the anti-tiling module for MicroSplat can greatly help break those things up. So we're going to talk about the techniques it provides. The first one I'm going to talk about is called normal noise. If I turn that on, it will recompile the shader, and then it will set up this section here called normal noise. And basically what this does is uses another normal map and blends that in with the existing normal map. And so if I turn this way up in strength, you can see that it's blending this normal map in to that terrain. It's actually blending it all over the terrain. And this can really help break up tiling on smooth surfaces like grass and deserts and things like that. And you can play with this scale to sort of get different effects and play with the texture to get different effects. And it really sort of adds nice levels of detail onto things. On some of these hills, it really adds sort of the kind of roughness and bumpiness that you would get. You can see how it's really kind of changing the way this looks and giving it a kind of a really nice look. It looks non-repeating. And so that's it's a really simple technique, but really powerful. And along with each of these comes a per texture property for each. So if you decide like this looks really good on some of my textures, but I really don't like it on this shore sand here, you can turn on the per texture property for this. And you can actually, let me go to the shore sand, you can actually just turn it off on this, right, by setting it to 0. Or turn it up and really like boost the amount of that normal that you add there. So it's really up to you on which textures you want this to appear on, and you can control it at a nice deep level. Go ahead and turn off UV scale. Let's go to the next feature. That's normal noise. Let's do distance resampling next. So distance resampling is a common technique. I've done it a little bit differently here. The basic idea of distance resampling is that as your texture starts to tile, you cross-blend into a version of that texture that is sampled at a lower MIP scale, so basically like tiled less. And then you blend between them, and then hopefully the user doesn't know. And so you can see how well this works on this cliff side. As we sort of get away from it, you don't notice the tiling anymore because we're using a larger version of the texture. And it's a little bit of a trick because you have to kind of play with the distances of this. So if I start that sampling a little bit earlier, you can see that it really, when we get really close, we see all the little details, but then it crossfades into this other texture. Now, something I do different here than I've done previously, and I've seen other ways to it, is that I optimize so that this only takes 2 samples. Normally, in this shader, following the way that this shader works, doing a resample would take an additional 4 samples. It would take an additional, let's see here, 4 textures, 2 samples, take an additional 8 samples. And in this case, it's actually taking an additional 4. So it's half as much. It's 1 sample for, it's only 2 because it's only doing the albedo and it's only doing the highest 2 textures weight-wise of that given sample. So this actually ends up being a really nice optimization because instead of paying for 8 texture samples, you're only paying for 2. And it gets you the best bits of the effect, the thing that really makes it work, and now it's very, very cheap. which is what we want in the shader, right? So let's talk about another technique. There's another problem, which is sometimes I get too close to things and things get blurry. And so I really get in here and I start to see the blur on this. Now, I could tile this texture more. I could certainly do that and use the distance resampling to help account for that. And obviously the grass is probably a little big scale-wise here, so these textures could be smaller, and that would help with this, but that would also increase the amount of tiling we see on the distance. So what detail noise does is it does a little detail texturing effect. This is one sample, okay? So there's only one texture here, and again, in all of MicroSplat, it will just hook up the defaults for you. So as soon as I turn this on, it grabs this texture, which is the default detail noise texture. You can make your own, and I can go over the packing formats of all of those if you want to do that. But basically, it lets you scale this some number of times inside the other texture. And so 8 is usually a pretty good value. I'm going to turn this way up so we can really see it. And let's see here. Oh, sorry, the scale values. I need to fix the scale values on this. They're a little out right now because they're based on the original UVs, which are currently 180. So to get to 8 times scale, we need something a little more like 800. So I will fix that so that it's based on the scaled UVs, so you guys don't have to type in really large numbers. You can just type 8 and 8 times bigger. But what you can see here is that, and we're clipping a bit here with the camera, but as I get close to this, and it would normally get blurry, like this, we can blend in this texture at another scale. And so this is kind of the classic detail texturing, and it creates this sort of like endless levels of detail where you get this sort of micro detail up close. And you can say how long, how far away this should fade out, so that you don't bother to do this at a far distance. And you can see, depending on our camera, you may need this to happen earlier or later. So that is a super simple little technique. Again, because of the way the texture is packed, it's one sample, and it affects both the normal and the PBR channels and everything, and gives them this nice noise. And on the distance resample, you can set the UV scale and where to begin and end it. I might not have explained that. And then finally, there's the same thing, but for the distance. So if we let's turn off all our other ones so we can really observe what this does cleanly, because we've started to build up this series of effects here. Turn off the detail noise. And now we're just going to put on what's called distance noise, which is basically just detail noise, but for the distance. So we turn that on, and then I probably have to set this to a scale that is, so this one is based off the UV scale correctly, so 10 times means it's going to tile this noise 10 times over the course of this terrain. And so here you see these lines coming in here, right? These little ridge lines and things like that. That's actually from this noise texture. If I set the strength to 0, you can see they go away. I set it to 1, it gets really noisy. And again, you can play with the scale, and you can play with the start and end fade on this. And what this can do is really kind of, adds the feeling of unique detail in the distance. And of course, you can combine all of these. We can put detail noise on. Turn on our distance resampler. We turn on our noise normal. Now what we're starting to see is something that really has a lot of detail, feels completely unique. We don't see any tiling of anything at any of our scales, and yet this is actually still fairly cheap. We can actually get really close into things and see detail. We can pull out, and again, we can go, each of these has per texture properties for how much of them we want on each of our 16 textures, so we can go and tune this for each surface and get something that really does look unique and doesn't have major tiling problems. Now, this isn't quite as good as MicroSplat's texture clusters. That is sort of the best solution for anti-tiling, but it is extremely cheap. And And again, you can tune this, deciding how many of these features you want to use and which ones you want to use for the look you want. So in total, with all 4 of these on, we're paying for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 extra samples over our terrain, which is really not a lot when you consider that a lot of these shaders are easily sampling 32 textures a pixel. So yeah, very cheap, and it works very nicely. Gives you a lot of sort of added control and detail to prevent tiling artifacts. So I hope you like it. I think it's worth the asking price, and yeah, let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.